I'm 93 years old, and I've survived 3 moments when the world felt like it was about to fall apart. In each of them, the people around me were afraid, trying to predict what would come next, as if that could bring some kind of safety. Back then, I did the same. I believed that if I could anticipate everything, I would be prepared. But what I didn't realize was that constant state of alert wasn't protecting me. It was slowly consuming me. My name is William, and I spent decades believing in the wrong thing. If there's something I understood too late, it's this. Anxiety isn't about what's going to happen. It's about the illusion that you can control what doesn't even exist yet. And what I learned after that can completely change the way you live today. I was still young when everything began to change for the first time. The conversations around me grew quieter, the looks more distant, and there was a constant feeling that something was about to happen, even when no one knew exactly what. It wasn't a direct kind of fear. It was something quieter, harder to explain. I remember watching people trying to act normal, as if sticking to routine was enough to push that unease away. But there was something in the air that wouldn't allow rest. It felt like living while waiting for news that never arrived, yet somehow already felt inevitable. It was during that time that I began to feel it for the first time, even without having words to describe it. A tightness in my chest that appeared for no clear reason, a constant need to think about what could go wrong, as if anticipating problems was a way to prevent them. I started to believe that if I thought hard enough, if I analyzed every possibility, I could protect myself from the worst, and for a while that even seemed to make sense. After all, being prepared felt better than being caught off guard. But what I didn't realize back then was that this constant state of anticipation wasn't making me stronger. It was slowly teaching me how to never truly rest again. Over time, that way of thinking stopped being something occasional and became the way I saw everything. I began analyzing every decision, every choice, every detail of my day, as if any mistake could trigger something irreversible. It was exhausting, but at the same time, it felt necessary. I believed that always staying one step ahead of problems was a sign of intelligence, of maturity. While other people relaxed, I was mentally reviewing scenarios, imagining possibilities, trying to predict outcomes. In my mind, that was responsibility. What no one told me, and what took me years to realize, is that there is a very fine line between being prepared and living in a constant state of alert. And I had already crossed that line without even noticing when it happened. Little by little, I stopped reacting to the present and started living inside futures that didn't even exist. My mind was always busy with what could go wrong tomorrow, the day after, or years from now, while the present went unnoticed. And the most dangerous part is that it didn't feel like a problem. It felt like the right way to live, as if carrying that invisible weight was the natural price for trying to keep everything under control. When the second crisis arrived, I was no longer the same man. I had responsibilities, people depending on me, decisions that felt bigger than anything I had faced before. And in a way, it only reinforced what I already believed. I needed to be prepared for everything. This time, the feeling wasn't just fear, it was urgency. Everything felt faster, more intense, closer, and I began to use that anxiety as a tool. I told myself it kept me alert, that it helped me avoid mistakes. I became someone who was always anticipating problems before they even existed. At work, in relationships, in the small decisions of everyday life. I didn't call it anxiety, I called it responsibility. And that made it even harder to recognize. People even saw it as something positive. They said I was careful, prudent, someone who thought ahead, and on the outside, it really did seem that way. But on the inside, there was a constant exhaustion, as if my mind was never allowed to fully shut off. The problem is that when anxiety starts to feel useful, you stop questioning how much it's costing you. And that's exactly what happened to me. I began to depend on it without realizing what I was losing along the way. Over the years, that stopped being just a behavior. It became part of who I was. I no longer made decisions without first imagining every possible scenario, as if each choice carried an invisible risk that had to be anticipated at all costs. I began to confuse worry with care, tension with responsibility. If I wasn't thinking about what could go wrong, it felt like I was being negligent. It was as if relaxing was the same as being careless, something I simply couldn't allow. The people around me started to see me as someone reliable, someone who was always attentive, and for a long time I took pride in that. I believed that way of living was what kept everything in place, what prevented things from falling apart. But without realizing it, I started drifting away from simple moments. I was physically present, but my mind was always a few steps ahead, trying to solve problems that didn't even exist yet. I wasn't living, I was preparing to live. And maybe the hardest part to admit is this: I thought that was maturity. It took me a long time to understand it wasn't wisdom. It was just fear, disguised as control. The cost of this didn't show up all at once. It built up quietly over time. It wasn't a big mistake or a single decision. It was made of small moments I let slip by because my mind was too busy trying to solve something that hadn't even happened yet. I missed conversations that could have gone deeper because I was distracted thinking about the next day. I stopped enjoying simple moments because there was always something in my head telling me I needed to prepare for what was coming next. And slowly that became a pattern. People were still there. Opportunities still existed. Life kept moving forward, but I wasn't truly present. I was always slightly distant, as if it was never safe to fully relax, as if something could go wrong at any moment. And the hardest part to notice was that on the outside, everything seemed to be working. I fulfilled my responsibilities, kept things organized, did what needed to be done. But inside there was a constant sense of exhaustion I couldn't explain. It was only much later that I understood this clearly. I wasn't avoiding problems. I was sacrificing the present in exchange for a sense of security that never actually arrived. When the third crisis arrived, I was already an old man. Unlike the other times, my body was slower, my decisions simpler, but my mind still carried that same pattern of anticipation I had built over decades. This time, though, something began to feel different. The world around me was once again filled with uncertainty, people worried, trying to predict what would come next. And for the first time, I found myself recognizing in that behavior something I knew all too well. I could have reacted the same way as before. I could have fallen back into that cycle of trying to control what was coming, but somehow I no longer had the energy to sustain that. And maybe that was exactly what made room for something new. I began to realize that despite everything being uncertain out there was a choice happening in here. For the first time, I wasn't being dragged automatically by my own thoughts. I was observing almost as if I were watching my own life from the outside. And it was in that moment, in the middle of yet another crisis, that something finally broke inside me. It wasn't the world that changed. It was me, for the first time, beginning to question what I had always accepted as truth. It was at that point that something became impossible to ignore. For decades, I believed that constant tension was what kept me safe, that thinking about the worst-case scenario was a way of preparing myself. But when I looked at it clearly, I realized that none of it ever truly prevented what was meant to happen. The crises came anyway. The losses happened just the same. And everything I had spent years trying to anticipate never unfolded exactly the way I had imagined. It was as if I had lived through every problem twice, once in my mind and once in reality. And then the truth became clear in an uncomfortable way. Anxiety is not protection. It is a constant attempt to negotiate with the future, as if thinking hard enough could change something that does not even exist yet. But the future never made that deal with me. I was never in control. I only felt like I was. And that feeling was convincing enough to keep me trapped for years, repeating the same pattern, believing I was being prudent, when in truth I was simply afraid. It was only when I stopped trying to predict everything that I realized something simple yet life-changing. Life never required me to be ready for everything. It only required me to be present when things actually happened. After that, the way I lived began to change in an almost imperceptible way. It wasn't a sudden transformation, nor something that fixed everything at once. It was more like a quiet adjustment, an internal decision to stop feeding thoughts that had never taken me anywhere. I started paying more attention to what was happening right in front of me, instead of trying to anticipate what might happen next. At first it felt strange, as if I were neglecting something important. But gradually, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time began to emerge. Relief. Situations still came up, problems still existed, but I no longer carried the weight of living everything ahead of time. I responded to what was real, not to what was imagined. And that completely changed the way I dealt with difficulties. I realized that most of the things I feared never actually happened the way I imagined. And when something truly difficult did happen, I handled it better than any scenario I had created in my mind. Not because I was more prepared, but because finally I was fully present at the right moment, instead of being fragmented across dozens of possibilities that never came true. If you're listening to me right now, there's a chance you're living like this too, always a little ahead of the present, trying to anticipate everything as if that could somehow protect you. I recognize it because that's exactly how I lived for many years. Maybe you call it responsibility, being careful, being prepared, and I understand, because that's how I justified this behavior for most of my life. But there's an important difference between preparing yourself and living in a constant state of tension. Anxiety makes you believe that if you stop thinking about problems, something will slip out of your control, as if relaxing were a risk. But in reality, what it does is pull you away from the only place where you can actually act, the present moment. You don't need to predict every scenario to handle what comes. You need to be available when things actually happen. And that's only possible when your mind isn't busy trying to solve a future that doesn't even exist yet. If there's only one thing I could tell you after everything I've lived, it would be this: be careful not to spend your entire life trying to protect yourself from something that only exists inside your own head. Today, at 93 years old, when I look back at everything I've lived through, I realize that my biggest mistake wasn't feeling fear. It was believing I had to live inside it to be safe. I spent far too much time trying to control what was never in my hands. The truth is simpler and harder to accept. Life doesn't ask you to be prepared for everything. It asks you to be present when it truly matters. And that changes everything. If this message made you reflect on the way you've been living, maybe there's still time to do things differently. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to continue this conversation, subscribe to the channel. There's still time.